minute late due to a technical error on the end of things here, but we're all up and running now. So hopefully you'll be able to see my screen as I share it there. And today we're going to be looking at long-term sickness and ill health capability. Now, if you've been here before, you'll know the rules. If not, then I'll go over the rules for you. So your microphone is automatically muted. So if you do need a cough or sneeze, don't worry, you're not going to interject or interrupt anything that we're talking about today. Also, we've attached a handout, one black and white, one in colour. If you're like me, you might want the black and white one to print out, take notes on. And also, you can send us your questions. So there's a speech bubble there with a question mark inside. If you click on that, submit a question. We are going to be running a Q&A at the end of today's session. If we don't get around to answering your question, we will be in touch with you directly afterwards to go through all of the answers. Now, that's enough from me at the moment. Let's meet our speakers. So today I am joined by Advisor Plus HR Technical Consultant Hannah Johnson and Team Coach and Senior HR Advisor Denise Molyneux. And they're going to share their expertise on the topic and get into the practicalities on what you can be doing to prevent any risks. So guys, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name's Hannah. So prior to working for Advisor Plus, I worked within a management team for a hotel chain. I then joined Advisor Plus around 10 years ago, and I've worked within a variety of sectors doing HR for them. Those sectors included telecommunications, manufacturing, and more recently, financial services. I've got a level 5 CIPD qualification, and my current role at Advisor Plus is a HR technical consultant, involves supporting the advisory team with complex and high-risk cases, focusing on upskilling and training. Over to you, Denise.
Fab, thanks Hannah. So hi everyone, I'm Denise. I've worked in HR for 10 years. I'm a team coach, as Matt said, supporting the advisory team at AP. I have experience dealing with various different cases, different HR topics, such as performance capability, grievance, high-risk cases, disciplinaries, flexible working, lots more. And I support the team on the advice line to provide guidance to managers dealing with issues within their business.
Superb, brilliant, thank you both. So what we're going to be doing? Well, today we'll be covering some real life cases that Hannah and Denise and their colleagues have managed in their time on the advice line and in their HR careers, with a particular focus on the differences between conduct and capability and why it's important to get the process right from the start. Now we're going to go over what a long-term sickness process is and what this looks like, some real life examples of long-term sickness and cases, and some of the pitfalls you might come across. Look at the benefits of occupational health support and how you can help get your employees back into work using reasonable adjustments. Now, we will make sure that at the end of the webinar, you can access the slides. As I said before, it's attached as a handout and we're going to use them throughout the webinar. We're also going to share the webinar recording with you afterwards, around about an hour after it's concluded, so you can watch it back on demand and share any links to the portal of the policies and areas you need to pay particular attention to. Obviously, I'll share more on how to access this at the end of the session, but for now, I think it's best we get going. So Denise, as a starting point, can you talk me through what a long-term sickness process is?
I can, thanks Matt. So long-term sickness happens when someone is absent for more than 4 weeks from the business for any kind of health reason. So I'm sure everyone attending today has been impacted by long-term sickness or health issues in some way or another. So be it yourselves, family member or a colleague, could have been affected in the past or currently going through that situation now. It's something that can impact all of us. So it's really important to start this process and set out real clear guidelines as to what support and occasion is required for both the employee and the business. So to make sure that you're complying with ACAS guidance, which is super important, and best practice, it's important that we set out expectations for reporting absence. So those type of things would include, for example, if an employee was unwell, they should notify the business at the earliest opportunity on the first day of their absence. Ideally, the process for reporting absence should be set out within your policies. It could be your employee handbook or your contracts of employment. So if it is in a policy or a handbook, you should also make sure that it's stored in a place that's really easily accessible for the employees. It could be something like your intranet, and that should be available for employees at all times. So the information should state who the employee should contact and how they should make and maintain contact moving forward for the duration of their absence. It should also include any information related to sick pay and what happens when they take sick leave. So something else to consider is if an employee is absent for a period of up to 7 days, they can self-certify their absence. So this means that they don't necessarily have to provide a medical evidence for the reason for their absence. However, it's still important that you document this within your return to work with the employee to understand the reason for the absence and make sure that they're okay to be back in work. That return to work is really important to capture all the information when the employee returns. So after 7 days of illness, so that would include non-working days and weekends, the employee will need to provide you with a fit note. So this will detail the reasons for their absence, how long they will be absent from work, and it will affect, and with effect, from the 1st of July 22, fit notes can be certified by a doctor, a nurse, it could be an occupational health therapist, pharmacist, or a physiotherapist. So when you're dealing with long-term sickness, it's likely that you'll find that the employee will submit regular fit notes. We often get these in intervals, maybe 2 to 4 weeks at a time. So the fit notes will ensure that you're getting up-to-date regular medical information throughout their absence, but it also depends on the nature of the absence and the medical professions that they're speaking to at the time. So it's also important to establish how you'll maintain contact with the employee moving forward and during their absence. I would always advise managers that I speak to keep a clear record of any kind of conversations that you've had and taken place, log all the dates of absence, and keep a real super clear record of what's been happening and the conversations that have taken place. So there could be many reasons why an employee is off on long-term sick. For example, they may have had an operation and need some time to recover. They could be struggling with stress or anxiety, and in some circumstances they may be ill due to an underlying health condition such as diabetes, or it could even be something like cancer. So therefore, when you're managing sickness absence, it's really important to keep in contact and support the employee also whilst monitoring the absence closely. So during periods of long-term absence, to ensure that you're aligned with ACAS, which is really important, it's good to arrange regular welfare meetings. You may have heard of these meetings before. So we'd often advise these meetings take place at least every 4 weeks if possible, but this will depend on the employee's situation. So this might be something to do with their treatment, any appointments they have coming up. And just as a reminder, this meeting is an informal meeting and it can be arranged at the employee's home. It could be in a local cafe, in a private area if that works for you and the employee, or you could invite them to the workplace if they're well enough to attend. Okay, so when arranging these welfare meetings, even though they are informal, I would always advise you send an invite letter, giving the employee at least 48 hours notice, setting out the reason for the meeting. It should also provide a clear date on the invite letter and the time of the meeting, and you can explain what will be discussed during that meeting in the letter as well. So it's important to have a note taker if you can, especially if you visited someone's home, so you've got that support and you've also got the note taker there so you can concentrate on what's being discussed. So following these meetings, it might be that the employee is unsure as to when they might be able to come back to work. Alternatively, as an employer, you might be unsure as to what to do to help them to get them back into work successfully when they're keen to return and when they're ready. So in those situations, we'd recommend that you consider obtaining a medical report. This might be via your occupational health provider, or it could be the employee's own GP and doctor. So although we would say the form of an OH report is usually preferable, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. So in terms of medical report, this can help determine whether the employee is fit to return to work in the near future and what adjustments the business can consider in supporting their return to work. Alternatively, the report can also determine whether the employee is unable to return to work in any capacity. So once you receive the report, a meeting should be arranged to discuss the report in full. If the employee is too poorly to attend the meeting face-to-face, other options can be considered. You could do something like a Teams meeting or even a call over the phone. If they're really too poorly, you can also consider things like written submission. So please be mindful in this situation that if the employee wishes to be accompanied by a colleague or a TU rep during these types of informal meetings, we do try and support where possible. That would always be my advice and guidance to a manager. So if a return to work is not possible in the near future, which sometimes does happen, it can be considered at this point. You can also think about your options and possible dismissal. So if you are thinking of going down this route, a meeting will need to be arranged to discuss this. And at this stage, the process will become formal. So you're moving out of the informal stage and into formal. So the invite letter for this type of meeting should clearly set out the potential outcome of dismissal, if that's what you're considering. 48 hours notice should be provided, and the option to have a TU rep or a colleague present in those meetings. We would always recommend a note taker in this type of meeting. If for any reason the employee can't attend the meeting, I'd always advise the meetings can be rearranged. So during the meeting, all medical documents such as the OH report, any kind of fit notes, medical letters from the hospital or GP, and any meeting notes that you've had previously should be discussed during the meeting. All reasonable adjustments should be considered and alternatives explored to support the employee's return to work, because really that is the main aim, to try and get them back in. If you're in the situation where they can't come back, then this is where you're now at this formal meeting. So if there's no alternative option and there's no potential for the employee to return to work, then the outcome could be at this point dismissal. Alternatives to dismissal could also be and should be discussed. This could be something like a change in the role with less responsibility for the employee. If you come to a point where you can't and you are considering dismissal, and that is where you're going with it, then when delivering the outcome, this should ideally be done face-to-face due to the sensitivity of the situation. A follow-up letter should also be sent, clearly setting out the reasons for the dismissal. That should be sent to the employee after the meeting. The employee does have the right to appeal the decision. Just be mindful, if that is the case, an independent manager should hold the appeal meeting. If an employee, if the appeal meeting is held and the outcome then must be communicated again to the employee through a letter following the meeting.
Spot on. Thanks for taking us through that, Denise. And there's certainly a lot for us to consider within these processes. Now, on that, do either of you have any examples of difficult LTS, long-term sickness cases that you've managed, so that we can better understand what this process looks like in like real life situations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's common for employers to be unsure as to how long to progress a long-term sickness issue is as well, because obviously they're very unpredictable of when the employee is going to come back. We can all be impacted by ill health, as Denise said, and we should all want to support our employees as best we can to obviously support them through that difficult time. However, it does also mean that sometimes as the employer, you need to make some difficult decisions to obviously help both parties in the long term. And I think that's where it becomes a little bit tricky. So I remember a case where we had a colleague who had 15 years service, had been with the business a very long time, and they were absent from this small business following an operation. At the point that I was made aware of the case, they'd been absent for 13 months. Okay. The employee had kept in regular contact with the business, they'd submitted fit notes, and the business had also supported them in paying them some accrued annual leave as well to obviously support with those financial pressures. However, there was no indication that they were coming back to work in the near future. So when the business came to me and approached me for some support, their assumption was that they couldn't exit the colleague as their absence was legitimate and was supported with medical evidence, including fit notes. However, with my support, we invited the colleague to a formal meeting to discuss the likelihood of them returning to work within the next 3 months. During the meeting, we discussed their well-being, what a potential return to work might look like, and this also included discussing adjusted duties, what their working pattern could be, and we'll kind of cover those adjusted duties later. I've got some examples that we can talk through. The colleague in the instance of the case that I was supporting, so they were unsure if a return to work was feasible. So the business reached out to the colleague's GP with their permission, and the GP report confirmed that the colleague was unlikely to return to work within 3 months. The meeting was then reconvened and the colleague was exited from the business with notice, along with any existing holidays that they have. Obviously, that's really important. I just want to caveat here that this was done in line with the business's policies and procedures, and before anyone on this call kind of looks to end the employment relationship before, we always recommend that you take advice from us. So ensure that you've looked into all the options available. So kind of, is there any other way that they can come back to the business in a different capacity maybe? Exiting someone due to ill health is classed as dismissal from a business. So I had to make sure when I was dealing with this situation, so obviously that the outcome letter was detailed as to why we'd come to that decision of dismissal. And I also had to ensure that they had the right to appeal as well. Denise, have you got any other cases with your experience and the clients that you've supported?
Yeah, I've got quite a few. Probably one that stands out in particular that comes to mind is a case with an employee and they were a roofer. They were employed as a roofer. So they went on long-term sick due to an underlying health condition of epilepsy. Throughout that time, they provided regular fit notes which clearly stated the reason with regards to their absence, and that was the reason why it was causing them to be off and have regular fits. So in relation to this, sorry, my internet's just dropped out a little bit. Oh, sorry. So yeah, so in relation to this, the employee had 10 years service. They were looking to leave their job, but their underlying health, due to their underlying health condition. However, they didn't want to resign from the business. The manager in this case wanted to dismiss the employee and provide them with 3 months pay in lieu of notice. However, we did have the fit notes from the employee, and both he and the business felt that the role was no longer suitable for him, as it involved working at height. You can understand that with having epilepsy and possible fits. So the business hadn't gathered any medical information to understand his fitness for his role. So importantly, there was no evidence as to whether or not the employee would always suffer from seizures, or it's a temporary, or whether it might improve with medical treatment. So they also weren't sure if the employee would be able to do another role within the business, and that didn't involve working at height. So advised the lowest risk approach in this situation would be to get either an OH report or a GP report from a medical professional to determine whether the employee was able to fill their role, if adjustments could be made or an alternative role could be explored before considering the exit from the business further. So if the business hadn't followed this advice and proceeded to dismiss the employee without the medical justification to do so, this case would have carried risk, such as a claim of unfair dismissal or a discrimination claim. An employer does have a legal duty, where possible, to make reasonable adjustments or to consider whether there are other roles within the business that could accommodate the employee with that underlying health condition.
Thanks for sharing those examples both again. It shows how different every single long-term sickness case is and how we have to look at them on an individual basis. Now, you did mention an example there of when a manager didn't follow the correct process, but what is an employee isn't following process and isn't keeping in contact with the business?
It's always really tricky, if I'm honest with you, Matt, when you've got someone who won't engage in that LTS process. As on one side, you've got someone who might be so unwell that they're struggling to maintain that contact with the employer. And then on the other side, you've got a manager who is in no doubt worried about that colleague, because obviously they've got that working relationship with them. I would always say that regardless of the specific terms of the contract of employment, an employee does have an equitable duty to maintain contact with their employer whilst they're absent for whatever reason. And I think that's really important, obviously establishing that as well. So when someone is avoiding contact with the business or isn't contacting them at all, the first port of call is obviously prioritising their well-being. Think about what methods of contact you've got with them. Although a phone call is always preferred way to speak to somebody, can you reach out to them via messaging or even via email? It might be more suitable for them, depends on how they're feeling and whether they're at home or in hospital. If they're struggling with the amount of contact the business is making with them, for example, checking in at the start of every shift, you can always look to agree regular times and ways of contact. This could be a phone call every fortnight or speaking with a particular manager that they are comfortable with discussing their absence and their well-being with. If you're still not getting anywhere, you can contact their emergency contact to make sure that they're okay. But when you do this, just make sure that you disclose minimal information. An example of this could be that they are, kind of ex-colleague is away from the business at the moment due to illness, and that you're trying to get in contact with them, and could you please encourage them to obviously give us a call to see how they are. If you don't have an emergency contact or you're not getting a response from them either, you may also want to consider getting the police involved to complete a wellbeing check when there's an immediate or real risk to life or risk of serious injury to them or another person. It's not easy to balance the needs of a business and an individual in these circumstances, so we'd always encourage you to seek advice at this point, to just make sure that those additional steps that you do make are appropriate for the situation that you're in at that moment in time. If I think about my experience with these types of cases, so even when people are struggling to stay in contact with a business, they will often send in fit notes, as most GPs will issue these via email, and it's more convenient to just forward these on to an employer digitally without having to engage in a detailed discussion about how they're feeling at that moment in time. We do see plentiful situations where an employee isn't engaging in contact with the business, nor are they sending in any fit notes. And this is really difficult for an employee to deal with, as it feels like you're at a stalemate. If you're in this position, firstly, it's really important to check your own policies and procedures, as your business might have a specific procedure for these exact circumstances. However, in general, what I would say is if you've not got a fit note and you've not got any contact with the employee, you may consider them as an unauthorised absentee and may no longer be entitled to receive sick pay if that's what they're receiving at that moment in time. You may also want to consider a disciplinary process for AWOL, which is unauthorised absence without leave. However, before starting this process, you should make sure that you've exhausted all of your contact options. So like I mentioned earlier about the next of kin option, it's always a good option to try and reach that port of call. You can then also use those contact attempts as evidence in your disciplinary process if it's required and if you get to that point. It's also important that you keep making those wellbeing contact attempts throughout the process, and remember that the key to any successful resolution in these circumstances is ensuring that the employee is okay. So from an employee's perspective, an AWOL process might be seen as a good way to resolve no contact situations, as if an employee doesn't engage with the disciplinary process, it might result in their contract of employment coming to an end. Problems may arise though if an employee then engages with the process and attends these meetings. So on a positive note, in that scenario, you've then establish that contact with that employee, and then you can agree a way moving forward of how you are going to maintain that contact. But it could also, on the flip side, make the employee feel worse and perceive that you're taking additional measures to approach their absence and you're not committed to getting them back to work full time. As a result, we would always recommend that you seek advice before going down this route, so that you can make sure it's the best thing for you and it's the best thing for the employee given the circumstances that you're in.
Again, that's some great advice, and we've heard you talk about OH referral or GP report, but what are the benefits to having these types of reports when an employee is off due to long-term sickness?
Yeah, okay, so I can pick that up. So I think, as we've said earlier, we're not the medical professionals. We don't have the capability to determine what the employee needs in terms of their recovery, how long this may take, and how the condition may impact the workplace. So an occupational health assessment is completed by a qualified occupational health professional. This could be a doctor, a nurse, health physician, or a specialist training. So they all have, specialist training. So it's always the employer who will request the report with the consent of the employee. So it's really important when completing the referral that you get the right questions across for the assessment that's going to take place. So this helps you get the best advice and the support from the report that you need. So questions you might want to consider adding to the referral are things like, how does the employee's current health condition impact their ability to perform their job? Is the employee fit to return to work in their full potential and capacity? Are there any adjustments or accommodations that could help the employee with their return to work? Or should any temporary or permanent adjustments be considered when they're coming back to work, and how can you help them? So another option could be to consider obtaining a GP report, although this process often does take longer and it doesn't always give you the information you require. The GP report is often cheaper, but I'd always advise you to go with the OH report, which is more beneficial, especially if you're considering dismissal due to ill health capability. The OH report can often provide real specific detail around the employee and respond to those questions, as we talked about just a little bit earlier, in terms of what you need and what you've put forward for the referral. So whilst a GP report does focus on the employee's specific condition and clinical perspective, providing a general medical opinion on whether they're fit to return, the OH report will provide you with the background of the case. They'll set out whether the employee is covered under the Equality Act, for example, and they'll also respond to the questions that you particularly asked as part of the referral. So this report will also provide you any recommendations for adjustments and for you as a business to consider to help support the employee back into work. In some circumstances, the employee may request to see the report before the business. That's absolutely fine. It happens quite a lot. Or they also may be comfortable to see the report at the same time as you. The benefits of obtaining the OH information is that the business has all the options and opinions from the OH nurse to consider and explore as part of making their decision if you move into ill health capability. So you can consider the needs of the business, but you can also consider the needs of the employee. We often see cases where great employees who have an underlying health condition, and with just a few adjustments to suit both them and the business, so it works for both, they're still able to perform well within their role and do, you know, a really good job and support the business as they have done before. Maybe their condition has happened, or the situation they've ended up in has come about.
So what happens if the OH report confirms that the employee is fit to return to work after long-term sickness, and then how can the manager support them with that?
So I always feel that it's always brilliant to receive an OH report which suggests that an employee might be able to return to work. And as Denise just mentioned, their advice is often invaluable in supporting the progression of the long-term sickness issues. However, it's not always easy putting the contents of the report into action in a way that is relevant to your business. So, for example, you might work for a manufacturing business and an OH report has been received and it states that the employee can return to work, great, but can only complete duties while sat down and can only be sat down for 2 hours at a time. That's going to be very difficult if they work on a manufacturing line and they need to be stood up and they're rostered on 8-hour shifts. So how do we balance these situations? So when we're looking at OH reports from a HR perspective, we'll often look as whether we can implement what is known as a reasonable adjustment. And these are changes an employee wants to remove or reduce a disadvantage in the workplace and can either be permanent or it can be temporary. So examples of adjustments could include finding a different way to do something. So if we take the manufacturing example, is there an alternative line that the employee could work on which would allow them to sit down? Or perhaps they could support in the office temporarily, kind of completing desk-based duties. Making changes to the work environment, such as providing them with additional equipment or support in the workplace. This could include giving them a specific chair or desk equipment to make sure that they're not exasperating a health condition at work. Alternatively, it could just be giving them a supportive individual to work alongside to help them with their tasks. Another example is making changes to someone's working arrangements. So this could include kind of changing their shift patterns. For example, do they find it easier to work later on in the day once their medication has fully taken effect? Does the employee need more frequent breaks than what they previously had prior to their absence? And if they do come back to work and they aren't quite ready to complete their contracted hours whilst they still recover from their ill health, could the business consider a phased return whereby we reduce their hours temporarily and then gradually increase these over the coming weeks for them to go back to their full contracted hours? A good OH report will often detail what these adjustments could look like, and if it doesn't, your OH provider will be able to answer these questions for you. If they haven't already, I would suggest obviously emailing them or suggesting if you could have a call to discuss it. If we talk about it from a legal position then, a business only has to allow reasonable adjustments for someone who is deemed disabled. So this is defined as somebody who has a physical or mental impairment that is deemed as substantial or long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities. So substantial is something that is more than minor or trivial. For example, it takes much longer to complete a daily task like getting dressed. Long-term means 12 months or more. For example, a breathing condition that develops because of a lung infection. But as you can see, this is a really wide definition, and this could be subjective depending on how the employee views the impact on their own health and on their day-to-day lives. So as such, and to ensure that we can get the employee back to the work successfully in the long term, it's always a good idea to consider whether adjustments are needed to create a successful outcome for everybody involved. The second part of the definition is whether an adjustment is reasonable or not. So if we go back to the manufacturing example that I gave earlier on, let's say that the report recommended that the individual would only be able to do office-based duties, and that due to the deterioration of their health condition, this would be a permanent recommendation. But the business is multi-site, and all of the administration is done on another site, which is 100 miles away. In addition, you don't actually have any vacancies in the office at the moment. So would it be reasonable for you to offer them a role that doesn't exist and is far away from their current location? Probably not. So what is going to be reasonable for one business is going to be completely different to another. And that's why before confirming any adjustments with the employee, you need to be sitting down with them and discussing the potential options with them. When having this discussion, use that OH report as a framework for this. For example, do they agree with the report? What do they disagree with? Do they agree that the adjustments proposed in the report might work for them? If you don't think the adjustments suggested will work in the commercial practice, then explain why. Have that conversation with them. And most importantly, the conversation should be a collaborative one. And if the suggestions within the OH report aren't suitable, can you work together with the employee to find something that might work for everyone? And lastly, just want to touch on as well that it's really important that you document any agreement that you make with an employee. This could be in a separate adjustments document or within their return to work form. Either way, it's important that you regularly review any adjustments that you've agreed to make sure that they're still working for the employee and the business too. We'd recommend that you, before you conclude this process, you set a date to review the adjustments with the employee as well, and understand what the impact of these have been. So for example, you could do that within like a 3-month time period of them coming back, for example. We also need to make sure as well that the employee knows that your door is always open, and regardless of any review date, if they don't feel the adjustments are working, that they can come and talk to you to improve things for the better.
Thanks for that, Hannah. It's really helpful to know a business can use OH advice in a way that works for them and the employee to get them back into work. And I know you mentioned a manufacturing example, but do either of you have any other examples that you think might be useful to share in this arena?
Yeah, I do. So many examples really when advising managers who work, for example, quite a few in the aviation industry. So it's often the case that due to health and safety with cabin crew, they couldn't fly for a period of time due to maybe side effects in relation to their underlying health condition, or in some circumstances, they weren't able to fly at all due to the health and safety risk their condition posed whilst working. So in most situations, adjustments could be put in place, such as moving a department, like Hannah was saying, on a temporary basis, or changing a working pattern, such as adding in some additional rest days in between flights. It's often the case as well with cabin crew, they would often find fulfilment in other roles, such as training or maybe ground duties in the airport. Now, whilst I understand, you know, not all businesses do have different departments, they might not be, it might be a smaller business, medium size, but often the adjustments Hannah has mentioned earlier, we do find that employees can achieve their objectives and perform really well within their role once those adjustments are put in place. So recently also had a case where an employee was an office worker, for example, and they had periods of both short-term sickness and long-term sickness due to stress and depression. The employee always was being a high performer, and they were really reliable. The business made adjustments following a return to work after long-term sickness, which included a phased return to work. There was flexible hours, such as their start times and finish times, to support them maybe after a poor night's sleep. Other adjustments, such as 1 day working from home, reasonable time to attend counselling appointments, and also a mentor, which was somebody who they could talk to regularly if they wanted to chat about their condition or how they were feeling, and discuss, so maybe movements forward, how the adjustments were working for them. So on this occasion, some adjustments were temporary, such as the working from home, and others have been made permanent, such as the flexibility with their shift start and end times. So over a period of time, with the support from the business, the employee still is a high performer, and they ended up having really low levels of absence. You can see that's a good example of where the adjustments have been in place and really worked for the business and for the employee as well.
And you know what, Denise, I completely agree, and I think it's so rewarding from a HR perspective when we know that we've got it right for somebody when they're coming back to work and it's deemed as successful. And when you're advised on those cases, it feels like a win for everyone. And I know that sounds soppy, but it genuinely does, because you do become involved in those cases and making sure that we've got it right for those people at the centre of it. Not to bring a downer onto it, but there are some cases where reasonable adjustments, can't be achieved for whatever reason. And a case that kind of springs to my mind is the case of Davis versus Gloucestershire Health and Care for NHS, which was back last year in 2024. So this is a bit of a good example of why we really need to think of those adjustments, but obviously very, very poor in their case. So the case, the employee was Mrs. Davis, as I said, and she unfortunately had a brain hemorrhage, which impacted her memory and her concentration. She also developed a sensitivity to light and noise. She worked in an office environment and struggled to concentrate due to the noise around her. Mrs. Davis raised these concerns with her employer, who, despite requests to move her workstation, move her to a different area of the office, this was refused. She also asked if she could wear ear defenders, and on the basis that she wouldn't be able to hear the telephone ring, this was also declined by her employer. Mrs. Davis went on to be absent due to work stress, and an OH report suggested that she wouldn't function well in a workplace without adjustments being put in place. So what she was asking for, the OH report deemed that as reasonable. However, her employer didn't make any adjustments whatsoever. She started to stay late at work so she could work in the office when it was quiet, and eventually it just became too much for her and she resigned from her role. She then made claims of unfair constructive dismissal and disability discrimination to an employment tribunal, and she was successful in her claim. So she was awarded over $27,000 for a loss of earnings and injury to feelings. So if we look back on this, what could her employer have done differently? Could they have changed her duties so that she wasn't answering the phone and could wear ear defenders? Would it have been possible to move her desk to a quieter area as she'd suggested? Could they just have invested in telephony software that made it easier for her to answer the phone? And incorporate those noise cancelling headphones for her as well? It's also worth remembering that what might be simple and a straightforward change might have the biggest impact on an individual. And if some good quality conversations had been had in this case, this may have enabled Mrs. Davis to remain working for them. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, if you can't get someone back into work for the foreseeable future and you feel that all the options to support them to get them back into work have been exhausted, you might want to consider exiting them from the business. If this is the case, please do seek advice and discuss how best you can do this. This is to ensure that both the employee and you are supported with this decision-making process, as it's not easy for anyone involved.
Again, that is spot on advice, because what we've heard today, everything is so unique and based on context. So reaching out and getting that support is kind of vital with every little situation that we've covered. So again, brilliant examples, and thank you for sharing the thoughts and examples with us today. We have had a lot of questions coming in, no surprises, following on from that. So what I want to do is just pick out a few, and if we don't read yours out, again, apologies, but we will be in touch with you afterwards. I'm going to move on to the first one that I pulled out here is, what if a colleague has breached or hit triggers due to their long-term sickness?
I'll take this one if that's okay, Denise. I've had quite a bit of experience with it. So returning to work shouldn't be a daunting experience for any colleague, regardless of the reason or the length of absence. It's important, as we said, to hold a documented return to work discussion with a colleague at the earliest opportunity. This should cover how they're feeling, any adjustments implemented, for example, phased return, and any business updates as well that they may have missed when they've been off. Should the colleague have breached or hit any absence triggers during their absence, this could be a prime opportunity to discuss these as part of that return to work conversation. Depending on what your company policies are, normally an absence of 10 or more days, obviously we're talking about LTS in this webinar today, would be counted towards an attendance trigger, but please check your policies. So although due to, if they are in relation to kind of an underlying health condition, you know, kind of something that you know about, as we spoke about before, disability discrimination, you may wish not to take any action and implement some adjustments or buffers instead. But I would recommend that you review this as a business on a case-by-case basis, as it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario.
Again, going straight to the context of the situation, isn't it, rather than just a one model fits all, I think. Another one came in here about phased return, and the question about what would it look like a phased return?
Yes, I think I touched on this one earlier on. So a phased return is utilised when a colleague returns to the business from a period of leave and requires additional time to settle back into work. So consider that they've been out the business for quite a period of time, and it may be quite full on to just come back in and just expect everything to be back to normal. So it can be anything from their initial week back in work, or it could be spread over a period of 4 weeks. If I think of an example of a business that I've worked with recently and been doing some work with, so they recently chose to give a colleague a phased return over 4 weeks. And what this looked like was 2 weeks was 50% of their contracted hours, and then the further 2 weeks were at 75% of their contracted hours. Denise, have you got any other examples?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on that. Thanks, Hannah. So I've seen a particular case if a colleague maybe is returning from surgery or treatment. So it may be really beneficial to give them some time to settle back into the working kind of life and getting used to their working hours again. So a question I am asked a lot around this pay element is the stance we would encourage businesses to take, really, in terms of what would they do in this situation. So what we would always say is review your company policies. If your policies give no advice or guidance on that area, it would be reasonable to offer to the colleague to only be paid for the hours that they work during the phased return to work. Larger corporations may look to agree maybe a paid phased return to work at the full rate. So this could be for a period of time. We'd usually suggest probably about 4 weeks. And if the colleague's unable to reach their contracted hours after this period of time, then they may decide to just pay them the hours that they're actually working, rather than supporting more with the phase.
Spot on again. Very, very good. Another question here, we've got time for 2 more, is how would I approach a situation where an employee refused to attend a welfare meeting during the LTS process?
Yeah, so I can take this one. We get this quite a lot on the advice line. So I think the main thing is to try and find out why the employee can't attend and what's the reasons behind this. So is it that they may be too unwell to attend? Consider maybe rearranging the meeting or holding the meeting by a different method. You could think about, as we mentioned earlier, it could be Teams, we could do it via email. You could contact or identify maybe an independent manager to support. It might be that they don't want to speak to that particular manager or feel anxious or nervous about it. We also mentioned earlier, you know, if they refuse to attend, ideally you would hopefully have an OH report in place to provide, which then obviously provides the information that you would need around all the medical information, whether they're fit maybe to attend the meeting, and all the updates on the medical condition in terms of where they are and how they're feeling. If the employee still refuses to attend or maintain contact with you, if you've got that OH report in place, you can explain to the employee that you can only go off the information available to you, which is what you've got in the report, and then you will progress with the process. This often encourages the employee to maintain or get in contact if you explain that situation.
Spot on again. Superb. And lastly, but not leastly, this is the last one we've got time for. What is an ill health retirement pension scheme, and how does this work for an employee?
It's a good question. So an ill health retirement pension scheme allows an individual to access their pension benefits early if they're forced to leave their job permanently due to illness. To qualify, they must be unable to perform their current job, and in some cases any regular employment, often requiring a minimum periods of membership, like 2 years, and a medical assessment confirming that their condition is permanent. The specific benefits can vary based on your pension plan and the severity of the condition as well, with some plans offering enhanced benefits. I've seen a variety of different plans that are out there for different businesses and different providers of this scheme.
Superb, brilliant. And like I say, unfortunately, that's all got time for questions wise. But just to wrap up, just before we finish, if you would like help with anything further, don't worry, we have you covered. Please feel free to check out any of the topics covered in the Sage HR Advice portal, or alternatively, if you're a professional or premium customer, please don't hesitate to call us on the advice line, where one of the consultants will happily provide you with any guidance on the topics that we've covered today. And again, I think reaching out for that support in this subject is more, not going to say more important than any other, but it's more applicable, I think, because of how unique illnesses can be, especially in different workplaces. Now, I'm going to be running a poll shortly to offer you the chance to hear more about the products that we are offering you. And there's no obligation, obviously, but with the ever-changing world, it might be something that you're just keen to look at in a bit more detail. So, alongside Sage Payroll, we offer other people solutions such as HR and HR Advice. Sage HR enables you to automate and simplify your HR tasks, ensuring you manage your employees fairly and consistently, supporting productivity, well-being and job satisfaction within your workforce. And you can also trust that with Sage HR Advice, you remain up to date with the latest employment law, HR and health and safety legislation, supporting your business work within legal frameworks, reducing the risk of tribunals and penalties. So I'm going to run the poll now. And if you'd like to hear more from us, we will be in touch with you. Now, this poll is only going to be on your screen for a minute. Have no fear, no obligation to click yes to anything. But if you do want to hear something, just put a marker in one of those boxes. So I'm going to leave this on your screens now for around about a minute or maybe less, depending on the interaction that we get. And after this has been on your screen, I'm going to go through what's coming up with our webinars heading into Christmas. That dreaded word that we start to hear around about November. As soon as Halloween closes out, we're straight in from pumpkins to tinsel with a blink of an eye. Terrible. Superb. So that has been on your screens for quite a while now. Just another couple of voting in there. Wait for that to clear up. Superb. And have no fear, if you didn't manage to click a button in time and it was too quick, you can send us a message in the satisfaction survey afterwards. But this is what's up and coming for you here. So we've got processing levers, 7th of November, mastering mistakes on the 12th of November, core HR on the 21st of November, and Ireland pay your end part 1 on the 25th of November at 11 AM. So I have to put my teeth back in there. But our next HR Advice Christmas special is going to be on the 2nd of December at 11 o'clock. So please get registered for that one. It's going to be a doozy. Other than that, because we've slightly run over, I'm going to thank you for your ears and your attendance today. Please complete the short exit survey. We rely on the feedback that you give us to know what topics we're going to cover next. Also, if you haven't had your question answered, we will answer it within the next 3 or 4 days once we get all the answers accumulated, put it that way. Other than that, I want to thank the guys again for your attendance. So Denise and Hannah, thank you very much for your input and your expertise on today's topic. And the rest of you, hopefully we'll see you all soon. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.